Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, you'll never be enough? Imagine being the son of a billionaire, but failing every single test, watching teachers shake their heads, classmates laugh behind your back, and your own father lose faith in you. What would you do if the world expected you to shine, but all you carried was shame? Now imagine the only person who sees your worth isn't a teacher or a parent, but the school janitor, a man who sweeps floors at night, humming old songs, carrying a wisdom no one notices. He offers you a choice: keep pretending, or learn the one secret that might just change your life forever. What if you were that boy? Would you have the courage to listen, to unlearn, to start again? Or would you keep hiding behind a last name that feels heavier than the world? This is a story about failure, dignity, and the unexpected light that can come from the shadows. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the rest of this journey. Daniel Whitmore had everything that most kids in Dallas could only dream of. At 18, he drove through the polished gates of Westbrook Academy in a brand new Tesla, its glossy black paint reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. His wrist carried the weight of a Rolex that probably cost more than most teachers' annual salary. His sneakers were spotless, the kind you'd never find on sale, and his backpack wasn't filled with books. It carried nothing but a pair of noise-canceling headphones and the faint smell of expensive cologne. He had everything, except purpose. Inside the marble corridors of Westbrook, lined with portraits of senators, CEOs, and generals, all proud alumni, Daniel was infamous, not for brilliance, not for leadership, but for failing. He failed everything: math, history, biology, English. Each test returned with angry red ink, numbers so low that even the teachers sighed when handing them back. They didn't scold him, though. No one dared. The Whitmore family name sat on the donor wall in gleaming gold letters. His father, Robert Whitmore, was a billionaire real estate mogul whose empire shaped much of downtown Dallas. The teachers knew better than to push too hard. Some even passed Daniel out of fear of losing the Whitmore donations that kept the school's new library shining. And Daniel knew it. That was the problem. He leaned on the privilege like it was armor. When the school counselor once called him in to discuss his grades, Daniel smirked, leaned back in the leather chair, and said, "I could buy this school if I wanted to. What's a GPA going to change about that?" The words spread like wildfire through the student body. Some laughed, others rolled their eyes, but no one dared confront him. That was the power of the Whitmore name protection, insulation, and isolation, all rolled into one. But behind the smirk and the swagger, Daniel was drowning. Every failed test chipped away at something inside him. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, not even to himself, but when he was alone in his room at night, staring at another report card filled with red letters, something cold coiled in his chest, a question he hated but couldn't escape. What if I really am useless at home? Things weren't much better. Robert Whitmore, his father, was a man carved from stone, cold, calculated, the kind of man who could close $1 million deal over dinner without so much as loosening his tie. He didn't believe in excuses, not even from his only son. One evening, after yet another phone call from the school, Robert stood in the massive dining room, his voice echoing off marble floors. "You're an embarrassment," he said flatly. His tone wasn't loud, it didn't have to be. It was sharper than any yell. If you worked for me, you'd already be fired. Daniel slouched in his chair, crossed his arms, and rolled his eyes. But I'm not your employee. I'm your son. The world doesn't care. Robert shot back, eyes narrowing. Either you become someone, or you'll just be another rich kid with a last name and no spine, and I won't carry you. The silence after that was heavier than the chandelier hanging above them. Robert's words weren't a bluff. He meant them. The next morning, Daniel walked through the school doors like nothing had happened. Same swagger, same grin, the same Audi keys jingling in his pocket. But inside, something felt different, something fragile. And that was the part no one ever saw. Most of his classmates envied him. Some despised him, but not one of them truly looked past the surface. To them, Daniel was untouchable as spoiled air on autopilot, gliding through life with a golden parachute. But every time another exam landed in front of him, every time he saw that big red F, he felt the parachute tearing just a little more. By fall, his grades were beyond saving. He was failing so badly that the school counselor warned him he might not graduate. Daniel didn't tell anyone. He couldn't. He wore arrogance like a mask, keeping everyone at arm's length. He drove fast, joked louder, and mocked the very system that was exposing him. But the truth gnawed at him. He was sinking, and he knew it. It wasn't until one bitter November morning when his father cut off his credit cards and took away the Tesla that Daniel felt the world closing in, forced to take the school bus like everyone else. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of a plain hoodie, head down, hoping no one would notice him. But someone did. As Daniel trudged through the side entrance of Westbrook Academy, he heard a quiet voice, not directed at him, just a murmur beneath the hum of a mop sliding across the floor. The only true wisdom, the voice said, calm and steady, is knowing you know nothing. Daniel stopped mid-step. He turned. Standing there, leaning slightly on a mop handle, was an older black man in a faded gray uniform. His posture was upright, his eyes sharp but kind, and his hands calloused from years of labor. It was the school janitor. Daniel blinked, a smirk tugging at his lips. "What did you just say?" The man looked up, unbothered. "Nothing you're ready to understand." "Boy." Then he went back to mopping, as if Daniel hadn't spoken at all. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't have a comeback. He walked away, but the words followed him, clinging to him all day like a shadow. By the time the final bell rang, that simple line one he didn't even fully grasp had unsettled him more than all the red F's on his report card combined. And he couldn't stop wondering, who was this man? Really? And why did a janitor sound wiser than every teacher in this place? The next morning at Westbrook Academy started like most others. The hallways smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh coffee drifting from the teacher's lounge. Students bustled through the corridors, clutching textbooks and sports bags, their chatter echoing against the stone walls. Daniel Whitmore strolled in late, earbuds wedged deep, ignoring the curious glances. His swagger had dimmed since his father confiscated the Tesla, but he forced himself to keep his chin high. He didn't want anyone to sense how naked he felt stepping off that crowded yellow bus. As he passed the East Wing stairwell, he noticed the janitor again. Same faded gray uniform, same calm presence. The man's mop slid across the tiles in practiced, steady arcs, like he wasn't just cleaning but performing something deliberate, almost ceremonial. Daniel slowed his pace. The words from yesterday were still gnawing at him. The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. This time, Daniel stopped. He pulled one earbud out and cleared his throat. Hey, old man. Yesterday you quoted somebody. Right, Socrates, wasn't it? The janitor didn't look up right away. He wrung the mop, placed it back into the bucket, then finally raised his eyes. They were sharp, intelligent eyes, the kind Daniel wasn't used to seeing outside a boardroom or courtroom. You remember that the man said, voice measured. Daniel shrugged, pretending indifference. Kinda hard to forget when the janitor starts spitting philosophy in the middle of the hallway. A faint smile tugged at the man's lips. What's hard to believe that a janitor reads, Daniel flinched. He hadn't meant it that way, but maybe he had. He stuffed his hands in his hoodie pocket. I just meant, it's weird, you know, quoting dead philosophers while you're mopping floors. The man leaned against his mop handle, unfazed. It's weirder, he said slowly, when a boy with the whole world at his feet can't pass a reading test. The words landed like a punch to Daniel's chest. His smirk faltered. For a second, he considered snapping back, but something about the man's calm gaze stopped him. You used to be a teacher, didn't you? Daniel asked. The man straightened, wiped his hands on a rag tucked in his belt. Not just philosophy, literature, ethics. Before life had other plans, Daniel's curiosity sharpened. So, what you're like? What? Some kind of failed professor for the first time. The man's eyes flickered not with anger, but something heavier. Older? He didn't answer. Instead, he extended a rough hand. Elijah Carter. Daniel hesitated, then shook it. Daniel, I know who you are, Elijah said softly. Everyone knows the Whitmore boy. Daniel withdrew his hand. Uncomfortable. Yeah, well, the Whitmore boy isn't exactly killing it in school. Elijah didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just studied Daniel like he was trying to read past the words. Then he said, maybe that's because you've been trying to prove how much you already know, instead of admitting what you don't. Daniel shifted on his feet. So what? You think you can teach me I didn't say that? Elijah replied, but I can tell you this, you're not as hopeless as you pretend to be. Pride's a heavy mask. Take it off, and maybe you'll finally breathe. The bell rang overhead, scattering students into classrooms. Daniel lingered a moment longer. Something about this man unsettled him. Not the words, though those cut deep, but the way Elijah said them, without judgment, without fear of who Daniel's father was. Nobody ever talked to Daniel like that. Not teachers, not classmates, not even his father. That night, Daniel lay awake in his room, the city lights of Dallas twinkling outside his window. His phone buzzed with texts from friends about parties, games, and late-night drives, but he ignored them. His mind kept circling back to that janitor's voice. Pride's a heavy mask. The next morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He showed up at school before sunrise. The halls were empty, bathed in a bluish glow from the emergency lights. And there, in the east wing, Elijah was polishing the floor in slow, precise circles. He wore a pair of old headphones, humming softly to some gospel tune. Daniel cleared his throat. Elijah paused, pulled out one earbud, and raised an eyebrow. Well, look at that. The Whitmore boy's up before dawn. Must be serious trouble. Daniel scratched the back of his neck. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. Which part? The part about admitting what I don't know? He hesitated, then blurted, "I can't keep failing. My dad's done with me. Everyone's done with me. I need help." Elijah studied him in silence, then leaned his mop against the wall. "Help isn't free, son. It costs something." Daniel frowned. "I don't exactly have money anymore." He cut me off. "I'm not talking about money," Elijah said firmly. "I'm talking about pride. If I teach you anything, you leave your last name at the door. You stop pretending you've got it all figured out. You start from zero, from the floor." Daniel swallowed hard. His chest tightened. To admit he was nothing, that he needed someone like this man, it felt impossible. Yet, wasn't that the truth he'd been running from? He nodded. "Fine, I'll do it." For the first time. Elijah's lips curved into a real smile. "Then we'll begin. Tomorrow morning, bring a notebook, empty, like your pride. We'll see if you can fill it." The following day, Daniel arrived again at dawn. Elijah handed him a battered notebook, its cover scratched, its pages yellowed at the edges. "This is yours now," Elijah said. "Each morning before class, we'll read. Each evening after I finish cleaning, you'll write, not answers, not homework, thoughts, what you saw, what you felt, what you questioned, no grades, just honesty." Daniel opened the notebook. The blank pages stared back at him like an open sky, terrifying and full of promise. "What if I fail again?" Daniel whispered. "Then you're finally doing it right," Elijah replied. From that day on, the janitor and the billionaire's son began their unlikely ritual. Each morning, as the city stretched awake, Elijah guided Daniel through passages of Baldwin and Hughes, asking questions that pierced deeper than any test. "What does courage sound like?" Elijah would ask. "What do you think silence means in this story? Why do you think this character refused to give up?" Daniel stopped seeing books as chores. Words began to pulse with meaning, and sentences tugged at something buried deep inside him. At night, in that battered notebook, he wrote about his father, about pressure, about the emptiness he carried like a weight he couldn't drop. Elijah read every word, scribbling in the margins with sharp red pen. "Don't just say it, mean it. This line is pretty but hollow. Rewrite it with your soul." And Daniel rewrote again and again. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from failure. He was learning from it. He didn't notice it right away, but something was changing. His shoulders weren't slouched with false bravado anymore. His eyes didn't dart around looking for approval. He walked differently, less like a prince and more like someone waking up. And, for the first time, Daniel realized maybe wisdom really could come from a man holding a mop. The library at Westbrook Academy was a cathedral of silence. Tall windows stretched toward the sky, spilling golden light onto polished oak tables. For most students, it was a place to cram before exams or whisper nervously about assignments. For Daniel Whitmore, it had always been a prison. Every time he sat beneath those stained glass windows, words blurred and numbers mocked him. His mind drifted, his chest tightened, and failure felt inevitable. But tonight was different. The library doors were locked for students, yet Daniel sat at the back table, notebook open, heart pounding. Across from him, Mr. Elijah Carter laid out a small stack of books worn soft by years of use. "Why are we here after hours?" Daniel whispered, half afraid the security guard would burst in. Elijah placed a finger on the Baldwin novel before him. because learning doesn't live in daylight. It lives in hunger, and hunger doesn't wait for permission. Daniel frowned, tilting his head. So, this is like what a secret classroom. Elijah's eyes twinkled, the only kind that matters. They began with James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Elijah's voice rolled like steady thunder as he read passages aloud, his deep timbre filling the cavernous space. Daniel leaned forward, words sinking into places textbooks had never reached. When Elijah paused, he asked, "What do you hear in his voice?" Daniel hesitated. "Anger, I guess, but also pain, like he's tired of explaining himself." Elijah nodded. "And what does that teach you? That sometimes people don't listen until it's too late," Daniel said softly. For the first time, Elijah smiled, not polite, not restrained, but proud. Night after night, they met, sometimes in the library, sometimes in the janitor's closet where Elijah stacked philosophy books between mops and buckets. Daniel devoured texts he once thought dull, Du Bois, Hughes, Emerson, even fragments of Socrates. It wasn't the books themselves that changed him. It was the way Elijah asked questions. He never gave answers, never lectured like Daniel's teachers did. He pushed Daniel to wrestle, to sit with discomfort. What do you fear most when you fail? Why do you wear arrogance like armor? What's heavier, your father's shadow, or your own doubt? Daniel wrote those questions in his notebook, circling them until the ink tore through the page. One night, as they closed Baldwin's book, Daniel whispered, "Why are you helping me? You don't owe me anything." Elijah leaned back, his gaze drifting to the high windows. "Because I once had a student just like you, brilliant but blind, thought money could buy wisdom. He didn't listen, and by the time life taught him different, it was too late. I won't let that happen twice." Daniel swallowed, throat tight. What happened to him? Elijah's jaw clenched. His silence was answer enough. From that night forward, Daniel stopped asking why. He simply showed up, but Westbrook Academy noticed. Teachers whispered about the Whitmore boy scribbling furiously in hallways, about how he started asking real questions in class. Some thought it was a phase. Others assumed it was a stunt to impress his father. Only Elijah knew the truth. Daniel was shedding his mask. Still, the change wasn't easy. Pride clawed at him, begging to be worn again. One morning, after a brutal math exam, Daniel slumped into their secret classroom, tossing his paper across the table. A giant red D bled across the top. "I tried," he muttered, "and I still failed." Elijah studied him. "What did you learn that I'm hopeless?" "No." Elijah's voice sharpened. "You learned where you're weak? That's not hopeless. That's direction." Daniel gritted his teeth. "But my dad doesn't care about direction. He cares about results." Elijah leaned forward. "And what do you care about?" The question stunned Daniel. Nobody had ever asked him that. Not his father, not his teachers, not even his so-called friends. He stared at the notebook, at the half-written answers scribbled there. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But maybe. I want to care about something more than money, more than names on buildings." Elijah's face softened. "Then we keep going." That night, they read W.E.B. Du Bois. Elijah guided Daniel through the concept of the double consciousness, the struggle of living with two identities, one imposed by society and the other held deep inside. "It's not just about race," Elijah said carefully. "It's about masks. You've been living with one identity, your father's son, but somewhere inside, there's another Daniel, One you're afraid to show? Which one do you want to keep? Daniel felt his chest tighten. I don't know who that other Daniel even is. Then our work isn't finished. Weeks passed. Winter descended on Dallas, the air sharp and dry. Christmas lights twinkled along the academy's brick walls, but Daniel felt no warmth at home. His father's silence had grown heavier, his disappointment thicker. At dinner, Robert barely looked at him. One night, after a particularly tense silence, Daniel excused himself and retreated to his room. He stared at his notebook under the lamplight. Elijah's red ink screaming from the margins, "Don't fake it. Say what you fear most." His pen trembled. Slowly, he wrote, "I'm afraid my father will never be proud of me. I'm afraid I'll never matter beyond his money. I'm afraid I'm already nothing." Tears blurred the ink. For the first time, Daniel didn't wipe them away. The next morning, he handed the notebook to Elijah without a word. Elijah read in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he set the notebook down and looked Daniel square in the eye. "That's the first honest thing you've written." Daniel's throat burned. "So what now?" "Now," Elijah said softly, "you learn the secret, not mine, not Baldwin's, yours, the secret of who you are when all the masks are gone." Daniel sat back, stunned. The janitor's words carried more weight than any grade, any lecture, any scolding his father had ever given. And, for the first time in his life, Daniel realized he wasn't afraid of learning anymore. He was afraid of stopping. Their secret classroom had become more than a place. It was a mirror, and Daniel was finally starting to recognize the reflection. But he had no idea how quickly that mirror would be tested or how fragile it still was. Winter at Westbrook Academy was crisp and unforgiving. Frost clung to the iron gates in the early mornings, and students rushed through the hallways wrapped in heavy coats. The chatter of upcoming exams filled the air, mingling with the smell of coffee from travel mugs and the faint scent of pencil shavings. Daniel Whitmore walked slower these days, not because he was lazy, but because his head was heavier with thoughts, with questions, with words Elijah Carter had pressed into his bones. He carried the battered notebook everywhere now, its pages swollen with ink, his handwriting messy but alive. For weeks, he had been showing up to their secret classroom with more focus than he'd ever known, and Elijah pushed him harder each time. The questions grew sharper, the red ink in the margins less forgiving. One morning, Elijah handed him a short essay assignment. Explain failure without excuses. Daniel scoffed at first, but late that night, he stayed awake at his desk, pen in hand, scribbling furiously. By dawn, his notebook held words raw enough to scare him. Failure is admitting I've been coasting on my father's name. It's realizing my arrogance was a shield for my fear. Failure is knowing I could be more, but I'm too afraid to try. When Elijah read it, his eyes softened. You're finally cutting through the noise. But cutting through the noise was one thing. Facing the storm outside their classroom was another, because outside, the world hadn't changed. Daniel's classmates still saw him as the spoiled heir. Teachers still doubted his effort. And at home, his father's silence had hardened into contempt. One evening, Robert Whitmore called Daniel into his office, a cavern of glass walls, mahogany shelves, and the faint hum of the Dallas skyline outside. Robert didn't look up from his laptop. Your counselor called, said you're still failing math, said you've been spending too much time with the janitor. Daniel's stomach dropped. He's not just a janitor. Robert snapped his laptop shut, finally meeting his son's eyes. Don't you dare romanticize mediocrity. I didn't build an empire so my son could waste time with a man pushing a mop. Daniel clenched his fists. He's teaching me more than you ever have. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The silence afterward was suffocating. Robert's jaw tightened. You ungrateful boy. You think some failed teacher who ended up scrubbing floors can make you into a man? You'll never survive in my world with that kind of weakness. Daniel's chest heaved. For once, he didn't back down. Maybe I don't want your world. Robert's eyes narrowed, voice low and dangerous. Then you'll have nothing. Not my name, not my support. Nothing. The ultimatum hung in the air like a guillotine. Daniel stormed out before his father could say another word. That night, he collapsed on his bed, notebook clutched to his chest. His father's words echoed. You'll have nothing. For days. The tension gnawed at him. At school, rumors spread someone had overheard the fight at the Whitmore mansion. Classmates whispered, some amused, others pitying. Teachers looked at him differently, like they were waiting for the inevitable collapse. Even Elijah noticed the change. You're carrying a storm, Elijah said one morning as they sat in the library. What's weighing you down? Daniel slammed the notebook shut. What's the point? Even if I change, my father will never see it. To him, I'll always be the spoiled kid who failed everything. Elijah leaned forward. And what do you see? Daniel's voice cracked. I don't know anymore. The admission shattered something in him. He left the library that day without finishing the lesson. The breaking point came a week later. It was finals season. Students buzzed with nerves, clutching study guides and muttering formulas under their breath. Daniel sat in math class, staring at the test paper in front of him. Numbers swam, mocking him. His palms grew damp. He tried to remember Elijah's advice. Failure is direction, not doom, but his father's voice thundered louder. You'll have nothing. Halfway through, panic swallowed him. He dropped his pencil, shoved the test away, and stormed out of class. By the time he reached the stairwell, his chest was heaving, vision blurred. He pressed his fists against his eyes, fighting the sting of tears. And that's when Elijah found him. The janitor stood quietly, mop in hand, watching the boy unravel. He didn't speak right away. He simply waited until Daniel's breathing steadied enough for words. I can't do it, Daniel muttered. I'll never be enough. Not for him, not for anyone. Elijah stepped closer, setting the mop aside. His voice was low, steady. You think your father's shadow is the world. It's not. It's just a shadow. And shadows only look big because the light behind them is strong. Daniel lifted his head, eyes red. But what if I don't have that light? Elijah placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Then you borrow mine, until you find your own. The words cracked something open inside Daniel. Tears spilled freely now. Not hidden, not masked. For the first time, he let someone see him break. That night, he returned to his notebook. His pen scratched furiously, page after page. I am not my father's shadow. I am not my last name. I am not my failures. I am still here. And maybe that's enough for now. When Elijah read those words the next morning, he didn't mark them with red ink. He simply nodded, eyes glistening, and whispered, Now we're getting somewhere. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the breaking point wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning of the boy finally stepping out of his father's shadow. and the world was about to notice. Spring arrived at Westbrook Academy with sudden bursts of color. Dogwoods bloomed along the sidewalks, the air carried the faint sweetness of magnolia, and sunlight spilled across the red brick buildings like honey. For most students, it meant freedom final exams would soon be behind them, summer internships ahead. For Daniel Whitmore, spring felt heavier. He had survived winter's breaking point. With Elijah Carter's guidance, he had clawed his way out of despair. He wasn't healed, not yet, but he was awake. And when you're awake, you can't go back to sleep, no matter how tempting it is. Every morning still began in their secret classroom, notebook in hand. Daniel wrestled with words that once would have terrified him. He filled pages with reflections, raw confessions, and tentative dreams. Elijah pressed harder than ever, forcing him to see beyond grades, beyond the Whitmore name. "You want the world to see you?" Elijah said one morning, sliding Baldwin's book aside. "But first, you have to see yourself." Daniel frowned. What if I don't like what I see? Elijah's answer was simple. Then you change it. But you can't change what you refuse to face. The lesson cut deeper than any math formula ever could. And soon, Daniel would face it in ways neither of them expected. It began with an English assignment. A senior requirement, each student had to present an original essay to the class, a reflection on identity and purpose. Most saw it as busy work, a box to check before graduation. Daniel dreaded it. For days, he stared at a blank page. Every time he tried to write, his father's voice roared in his head. "You'll have nothing." He nearly gave up. But then he flipped open his battered notebook, the one filled with Elijah's red ink. He reread his own words. "I am not my father's shadow. I am still here." Maybe that's enough. And suddenly, the essay poured out of him. He wrote about masks, how arrogance had been his shield, how failure had haunted him, how the weight of his last name nearly crushed him. He wrote about Elijah's questions, about nights in the library, about discovering that ignorance wasn't shameful if you were willing to learn. By dawn, he had filled 10 pages. For the first time, he didn't feel like a fraud. He felt like someone telling the truth. The day of presentations, Daniel sat at the back of the classroom, palms sweating, heartbeat thundering. Students read essays about career goals, family vacations, summer internships. Then it was his turn. He walked to the front, pages trembling in his hands. Whispers rippled through the room. The Whitmore boy never volunteered for anything. Daniel cleared his throat. His voice shook at first, then steadied. He read about failure, about pride, about the janitor who challenged him to drop the mask. He didn't name Elijah, but the truth pulsed through every word. By the time he finished, the room was silent, not mocking, not dismissive, silent in a way that felt like listening. The teacher blinked, stunned. Then, slowly, she began to clap. One by one, students joined until the entire classroom was applauding. Daniel stood frozen, the sound washing over him. For the first time, he wasn't clapped for his father's money or his last name. He was clapped for himself. Word of the essay spread quickly. Teachers whispered about the transformation. Students who once dismissed him started asking questions, curious about the shift. Even the headmaster called him into his office, curious about what had changed. But not everyone was impressed. That evening, at the Whitmore mansion, Robert confronted him. "I heard about your little essay," Robert said, pouring a glass of scotch. "People are saying you bared your soul." Is that what you want to be known for? Weakness. Daniel swallowed hard. His hands trembled, but his voice didn't. It wasn't weakness. It was truth. For once, I wasn't pretending. Robert set the glass down with a sharp clink. You're a Whitmore. People don't want your truth. They want results. They want power. Daniel met his father's eyes, chest tightening. Then maybe I don't want to be just a Whitmore anymore. The silence that followed was colder than winter. That night, Daniel stormed into the East Wing stairwell at school, notebook in hand. Elijah was there, wiping down the banisters. I did it, Daniel said breathlessly. I stood up, I read it. They listened. Elijah studied him, and how did it feel? Daniel's voice cracked, like I was finally alive. For a moment. Elijah's face softened, pride flickering in his eyes, but then he grew serious. That's just the beginning. Words are sparks, but sparks can burn out unless you feed the fire. What do you mean? Daniel asked. Elijah said quietly, the world will test whether your truth holds under pressure. It's one thing to speak it in class. It's another when the weight of your father, your name, and this whole city push back. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't know what test Elijah meant, but he would find out soon enough. Because a week later, the headmaster announced the senior assembly. Every graduating student would nominate one essay to be read aloud before the entire school faculty, families, and community leaders. Daniel's English teacher nominated his. When he found out, Daniel froze. To share his words with classmates was one thing. To read them before the entire academy, his father included, was unthinkable. That night, he told Elijah, I can't do it, Daniel said, pacing the janitor's closet. It's one thing to be vulnerable in class, but in front of him, in front of everyone, he'll tear me apart. Elijah leaned back against the shelves, arms crossed. So you're afraid? Of course I'm afraid, Elijah nodded slowly. Good. Fear means you're standing on the edge of something that matters. Daniel stopped pacing, chest heaving. But what if I fall? Then you get back up, Elijah said simply. That's the secret. Daniel, not avoiding the fall, surviving it. The words settled heavy in the air. On the day of the assembly, the auditorium buzzed with chatter, parents in suits, students in uniforms, teachers lined along the walls. At the front row sat Robert Whitmore, posture rigid, expression unreadable. Daniel's hands shook as he walked onto the stage. The microphone loomed like a threat. He looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces, at his father's piercing eyes. For a moment, panic surged. His chest tightened, his throat locked. Then he remembered Elijah's voice. Borrow my light until you find your own. He took a breath, and he began to read. The auditorium at Westbrook Academy smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, casting warm light across rows of velvet seats filled with parents, donors, and teachers. It was the kind of gathering where appearances mattered more than truth, where every student's performance was weighed not only as a grade, but as a reflection of family prestige. Daniel Whitmore stood backstage, palms clammy against the worn pages of his essay. He could hear the low hum of the crowd, punctuated by the occasional polite cough or shuffle of programs. His chest felt like it might split open. He peeked through the curtain and spotted his father in the front row, jaw set like granite, a glassy, scotch-colored stare even without the drink in his hand. Robert Whitmore didn't clap for anyone, didn't smile, didn't soften. He simply judged. Daniel's name was called. The walk to the podium felt like trudging through mud. Each step echoed louder than the last until the hall fell into a hush. He placed his trembling papers on the stand, adjusted the microphone, and swallowed hard. "My name," he began, voice shaky, "is Daniel Whitmore. Some of you know me as the son of Robert Whitmore, and for most of my life, I thought that was enough." A murmur ran through the audience. He steadied himself. "But the truth is, I failed. I failed every test, every subject, not because I couldn't learn, but because I refused to. I hid behind arrogance. I wore my last name like armor, and while I was busy pretending to be untouchable, I was actually drowning." The auditorium was still. Even the air seemed to pause. He took a breath and continued. "And then one day, someone most of you don't see stopped me in a hallway. He wasn't a teacher. He didn't have an office. He had a mop. His name is Mr. Elijah Carter." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Students sat straighter. Parents leaned forward, surprised that the golden son of the Whitmore Empire was speaking about the janitor. He asked me questions I couldn't answer. Hard ones, about courage, about silence, about truth. And when I had nothing, he gave me something I never expected. He gave me the chance to start again, to admit I knew nothing, to begin learning for real. At the back of the room, Elijah stood in his work uniform, bucket beside him. He had tried to stay hidden in the shadows, but now hundreds of eyes turned his way. Daniel's voice steadied, growing stronger. "This man taught me that learning isn't about grades or diplomas. It's about transformation. It's about becoming someone worth remembering. He didn't just clean these floors. He cleared the fog in my head. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today." The words hung heavy. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause began not from the front row, not from the wealthy parents, but from the students. It spread like a fire, filling the hall with thunder. But not everyone clapped. Robert Whitmore sat frozen, his face pale with fury. He didn't applaud. He didn't even blink. When the ovation died down, Daniel closed with a quiet conviction. "So what does it mean to win in life? It isn't about money, or power, or the size of your house. Winning means waking up, telling the truth, and using it to lift others. That's the secret I almost missed." He stepped away from the podium to a roar of applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of teachers. Students cheered. Even a few skeptical parents rose to their feet. But Robert remained seated. After the assembly, in the marble hallway outside the auditorium, Robert cornered his son. His voice was low, sharp as broken glass. "You humiliated me. In front of donors. In front of the board." Daniel's throat tightened, but he refused to look away. "I told the truth." "The truth," Robert spat. "You credited a janitor over your own father. Do you understand what that makes us look like?" Daniel's voice trembled but didn't break. "It makes us look human. Something I think you forgot how to be." Robert's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Daniel thought his father might strike him. But instead, Robert turned away with icy calm. "Pack your things. When this semester ends, you're out. No money, no apartment, no trust fund. You want to be a man of truth? Then survive without me." The words hit like a blow, but Daniel stood tall. For the first time, he didn't beg, he didn't cower, he simply nodded. "Fine." That night, Daniel met Elijah in the stairwell. His face was pale, eyes rimmed red, but his posture was steady. "He cut me off," Daniel whispered. "Everything, the trust fund, the apartment, I'm out." Elijah studied him quietly, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're free." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Free? I don't even know where I'll sleep next month." "Free," Elijah repeated, eyes steady, "because now you get to decide who you'll be. Not your father, not your name. You." Daniel's throat ached. For a long moment, he let the words sink in, and deep down, beneath the fear, he felt something new, something terrifying, but alive. Hope. The days that followed were turbulent. Students whispered about his speech. Some mocked him. Others approached quietly, thanking him for saying what they couldn't. One girl slipped him a folded note that read, "You gave me courage to speak up at home." But then came the twist no one saw coming. 2 days after the assembly, Elijah was called to the headmaster's office. Parents had complained. Donors had whispered. Inappropriate influence, they called it. Unorthodox teaching. That afternoon, Elijah's badge was deactivated. By evening, he was gone. Daniel searched the halls, desperate. No mop, no bucket, no quiet hum of gospel songs at dawn, just emptiness. He collapsed in the abandoned library, notebook clutched to his chest. For the first time in months, he felt the old darkness creep back. But then he opened the notebook. Elijah's red ink stared back at him. "Borrow my light until you find your own." Tears burned his eyes. Elijah had prepared him for this moment all along. Daniel closed the notebook, wiped his face, and whispered into the silence. "Then I'll carry it. For both of us." The morning after Elijah's sudden dismissal, Westbrook Academy felt hollow. Students bustled through the corridors with their usual chatter, but to Daniel, the place seemed stripped of color. No humming from the stairwell, no faint scent of lemon cleaner trailing behind a mop, no calm, steady presence reminding him that he wasn't invisible. Elijah was gone. Daniel sat in the library that night, staring at the empty chair Elijah used to claim. He flipped through his notebook, fingers trembling over the words marked in red ink. Each phrase felt like a lifeline. Don't just write it, mean it. Ignorance isn't failure if you admit it. Transformation is messy but real. But the more he read, the angrier he became. Elijah had been fired not because he did anything wrong, but because he had done something too right. He had reached students in a way the system didn't understand, and for that he was silenced. It was the same silence that had nearly swallowed Daniel his whole life. The rage burned so hot it scared him. For the first time, he understood why Elijah always warned him, "The world will test you. Sparks can burn out unless you feed the fire with purpose." That night, Daniel decided he couldn't let Elijah's light die. The next day, he printed his essay, "The Courage to Unlearn," and posted it on the school's bulletin board. He taped copies to the cafeteria walls, slipped pages into lockers. Within hours, whispers spread through the academy. Students read his words, some scoffing, some nodding, some quietly tearing up. By evening, 3 classmates approached him in the courtyard. "You wrote this?" one of them asked, holding a crumpled copy. Daniel nodded. The boy shifted uncomfortably. "I thought you were just the Whitmore kid. But this feels real," another girl added softly. "I didn't think anyone else felt like me. Like we're just pretending to be fine." Daniel looked at them, stunned, his words born in pain, had begun to echo. For the first time, he wasn't just a student desperate to be seen. He was a voice others leaned toward. The small group began meeting after school in the abandoned library. At first it was 3, then 5, then 10. They shared essays, stories, fears. Daniel didn't try to replace Elijah. He couldn't, but he carried Elijah's method forward: questions instead of lectures, honesty instead of grades. One evening, he held up Baldwin's worn book, its margins still filled with Elijah's handwriting. "This was given to me," Daniel said, voice steady. "It kept me alive when I thought I had nothing. I want to pass it on, not just the book, but what it means. We learn so we can change, and we change so we can help someone else." The students leaned in. In that dim library, surrounded by stacks of forgotten books, something powerful began to stir a quiet revolution. But the pushback came quickly. Parents complained again. Some accused Daniel of forming a cult or exploiting sympathy. The assistant principal called him into the office, her tone clipped and rehearsed. "You are not authorized to gather students in that manner. It's disruptive, inappropriate, and frankly, dangerous to the academy's reputation." Daniel's stomach clenched, but he held his ground. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're just learning in a way that matters. Your behavior is unacceptable." She snapped. "If it continues, disciplinary action will follow." For a moment, Daniel almost backed down. The weight of his father's threats still hung over him. No money, no safety net. But then he remembered Elijah's words. "Fear means you're standing on the edge of something that matters." So he said quietly, "Then maybe you should rethink what acceptable means." The assistant principal's glare could have cut glass. News traveled fast. By the end of the week, whispers about the Whitmore rebellion spread through the school like wildfire. Some mocked him, others were intrigued. Reporters began sniffing around after all. The fall of a billionaire's son was gossip too tempting to ignore. One afternoon, Daniel returned to his locker to find a folded note. No name, just a sentence scribbled in hurried ink. "Your fight is bigger than this school. Don't stop." The words shook him. He realized this wasn't just about him, or even about Elijah. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Everyone whose voice had been silenced because it didn't fit the script. That night, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at a blank page. He could hear his father's voice sneering in his head, the assistant principal's warning, the student's fragile hope. He picked up his pen and wrote, "If they fire us for telling the truth, then maybe the truth is what needs to be fired into the world." And with that, his next speech began to take shape. Weeks passed, and the library gatherings grew. Students who had once ignored him now showed up after class, drawn by curiosity, by need, by hunger for something real. They debated history, questioned textbooks, wrote about family struggles, racism, loneliness, pressure. Daniel didn't have all the answers, he never pretended to. But he asked questions that cracked open silence. In quiet moments, he still missed Elijah fiercely. Sometimes he swore he could hear that low, humming echo in the stairwell. But grief had become fuel. Instead of breaking him, it built him. One evening, while students scribbled in their notebooks, Daniel looked around the room. The sight hit him like a wave once. He'd been a boy drowning alone. Now, he was part of something larger, something alive. His voice caught as he whispered to himself, "You were right. Elijah, sparks can become fire. But the true test was still ahead. As spring edged toward graduation, the school announced its annual senior speech contest. The theme, What It Means to Win in Life. The winner would present before the entire community: students, parents, alumni, local press. Daniel's classmates pushed him to enter. At first, he resisted. Too risky, too public. His father would be there, ready to tear him down. But then he thought of Elijah being escorted out in silence. He thought of the girl who said his essay gave her courage. He thought of every student who had started to see themselves in his words. Daniel realized this wasn't just his chance. It was theirs. So he signed up. The weeks leading to the contest were brutal. He rewrote his speech again and again, tearing pages, scribbling late into the night. Each draft felt hollow until he returned to Elijah's voice in his notebook. Don't just say it, mean it. The final version didn't read like an essay. It read like a confession, a manifesto, a heartbeat. It was raw, honest, and alive. The night before the contest, Daniel stood alone in the library. He placed Baldwin's book on the table, ran his hand across its worn cover, and whispered, "Tomorrow, I speak for you." The silence around him felt heavy but not empty. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He was ready. The auditorium at Westbrook Academy had never felt so alive. Rows of seats overflowed with parents, teachers, alumni, and students in their pressed uniforms. The air was electric with expectation. This was the senior speech contest, the school's proudest tradition. Daniel Whitmore stood backstage, his hands trembling around a stack of note cards he no longer planned to use. His throat was dry, his heart pounding against his ribs. Beyond the curtain, he could hear the buzz of conversation, the polite laughter, the rustle of programs being folded and unfolded. And somewhere out there, he knew, sat his father. Robert Whitmore had arrived in a tailored Navy suit, his jaw set, his presence commanding attention. For him, this was less about his son and more about the family name. His eyes scanned the stage like a battlefield, prepared for disappointment. Daniel inhaled deeply. He touched the inside pocket of his blazer where Baldwin's book rested. Worn and frayed. Elijah's handwriting still alive in the margins. It wasn't just a book anymore, it was his compass, his reminder that words could light the way. The MC announced his name. Applause filled the room, polite and restrained. Daniel walked to the podium, each step echoing louder than the last. He looked out at the sea of faces, skeptical, curious, waiting. His father's eyes bore into him, cold and expectant. Daniel placed his notes aside. His hands gripped the edges of the podium. His voice, shaky at first, began to rise. When I was younger, I thought winning meant being the loudest, the smartest, the one with the highest score or the biggest name. I thought if I failed, I was worthless. And I failed a lot. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Daniel pressed on. I failed because I was afraid. Afraid I could never live up to my father's shadow. Afraid that if people saw me stumble, they'd know the truth that I didn't believe I was enough. And for a long time, I wasn't. He paused, eyes sweeping the crowd. Some students leaned forward. Teachers shifted in their seats. But someone showed me that failure isn't the end. It's the start. A man who pushed a mop through these hallways taught me more about courage and dignity than any textbook ever did. He taught me that education isn't about memorizing answers. It's about asking the right questions. he showed me that the smallest voice can carry the loudest truth. A hush fell over the room. Daniel could see students nodding, some clutching the edges of their chairs. He was fired for caring too much, for seeing me, not my last name, not my report card, but me. And I stand here today because he gave me the courage to see myself, to unlearn the lies I'd been told, to believe that even a broken voice can still sing. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice steady now. Winning in life isn't about beating others. It's about refusing to let the world convince you that you don't matter. It's about finding the courage to keep learning, even when you stumble. It's about passing on the fire so someone else doesn't freeze in the dark. The silence in the auditorium was thick, almost holy. Daniel let the words hang, then stepped back from the podium. The applause began softly, one clap, then another, before it swelled into a roar that shook the walls. Students rose to their feet, some cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. Teachers clapped, alumni nodded, parents exchanged glances, and in the middle of it all, Robert Whitmore sat stone-faced. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, almost reluctantly, his hands came together, a slow clap, stiff and measured, but his eyes, hard and unyielding for so long, softened, if only for a flicker. Daniel caught it, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was chasing his father's approval. He was standing in his own light. After the ceremony, students swarmed around him. Some hugged him, others pressed folded notes into his hands. A girl whispered, "You said everything I've wanted to say." A boy muttered, "Thanks for proving we're not alone." That night, Daniel walked home beneath the wide Texas sky. Stars shimmered above, cool air filling his lungs. For once, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. In his room, he opened Baldwin's book again. Inside the front cover, Elijah's handwriting stared back at him. "Knowledge is fire. Pass it on," Daniel whispered into the quiet. "I will." Months later, he kept his promise. He launched a small foundation, the Whitmore Initiative, not with his father's money, but with donations from classmates, teachers, and alumni moved by his words. The mission was simple: to fund after-school programs led by unsung mentors, the janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, people who carried wisdom often overlooked. Elijah never returned to Westbrook. But one evening, as Daniel spoke at a community center in Dallas, he spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. Older, a little more tired, but unmistakably Elijah. Their eyes met across the room. Elijah smiled a quiet, proud smile and nodded. Daniel's chest tightened. He finished his speech, applause filling the hall, but all he could think was he came back to see. Afterward, Elijah approached. His voice was the same, low, steady, grounding. "You found your light?" Daniel swallowed hard. "You gave me the spark." They didn't need more words. Sometimes the deepest truths lived in silence. Years later, people would tell the story of Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire's son who failed every test but found his voice through a janitor's secret. Some would call it a miracle. Others would call it rebellion. But Daniel knew the truth. It wasn't about miracle or rebellion. It was about listening when the world told you to ignore. It was about unlearning lies and daring to write new ones. And most of all, it was about the secret Elijah had given him, that even the smallest ember, if protected, could become a fire that lit the way for many. Under the wide Dallas sky, Daniel kept that fire burning, and it spread farther than either of them could have imagined. at its heart. This story isn't just about a billionaire's son or a janitor, it's about us. It reminds us that failure does not define us. Our response to it does. Many of us have lived under expectations, family, society, or our own and felt crushed when we stumbled. But like Daniel, we can unlearn the lies that bind us. We can choose to see failure as direction, not doom. The janitor's wisdom shows that the people who shape us are not always the loudest voices or the ones with power. Sometimes, it is the quiet, overlooked figures who remind us of our humanity. For older audiences, the message is even clearer: dignity, compassion, and patience can leave legacies far greater than wealth or titles. This story calls us to pause, to reflect. Who have we overlooked in our own lives, and what wisdom might be waiting there? If only we listen. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need hope, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep these stories alive, stories that remind us of dignity, compassion, and the quiet power of change.